Are you a fan of Linux desktops? This is the Docker installation video for you. Docker Desktop for Linux is actually a new thing in 2022. People have been asking about it for years, and Docker finally delivered. So now we have Docker Desktop, what I consider the best way to run Docker locally for Mac, Windows, and now Linux. In this video, we're going to get you Docker Desktop the easiest way possible on Linux. Then we're going to tweak some of the settings you might need to change. And then, of course, get the course repository from GitHub and get VS Code, my preferred editor for any DevOps. And for Linux desktops, I am saying Docker Desktop is the best way to experience and learn Docker Desktop on your local machine. Now, for years, we have had the standard Docker engine for Linux. In fact, that's how Docker got started all those years ago in 2013. It was just running on a Linux VM or server that you had somewhere. And we didn't really have a good setup locally. It was only till years later that Docker Desktop came around with all of its extra features and the GUI. But they're not necessarily the same thing. Docker Desktop is a superset of the Docker engine and the CLI. And on a Linux desktop, you could choose to just run the Docker engine, the Docker CLI, and the other tools manually by installing them with your package manager for Linux. But Docker Desktop does a little bit different. It does it by creating a VM, a small little tiny VM inside your Linux desktop, just like Mac and Windows do. One of the main reasons Docker chose to do this, instead of just installing a GUI that manages the Docker engine installed on your host OS, which you could do, but Docker Desktop on Linux, it chooses to do it exactly the same way as Mac and Windows for many reasons. One of them is to give a consistent user experience across all three OSs for running local containers. One of my favorite things about Docker Desktop, besides all the features and the GUI and it managing all my settings for me, is that I can wipe it really quick. I can actually go in and click reset and it'll delete all of the things I've changed and sort of reset it back quickly. With a host Docker engine, that's one of the things you don't get. Now you could use both. In fact, the Docker Desktop that I'm going to recommend you install here, I recommend you really just stick with that for now. But if you're someone who already knows a little bit about Docker and you prefer to just keep it simple, command line only, you could install the standard Docker engine. For that, the next video will focus on Docker engine for Linux server, because that's really a command line only solution, and that would be my normal Linux preferred option for you until now that we have Docker Desktop for Linux. So Docker Desktop for Linux is a superset of that, and again, it provides all those benefits of running in a VM, and it's better isolated, and you can quickly delete it and recreate it. It automatically updates all the versions of things. It runs over a VPN. All the things that maybe the raw standard Docker engine and command line, which again, next video for that one, they don't necessarily give you. But you don't have to choose. You can actually run both on your Docker desktop if you wanted. It's going to be a little confusing at first since you're still just learning Docker, but you can actually use Docker command line, something called Docker context, to switch between one or the other. So you can have your command line control either the one in the VM with Docker Desktop or the one running natively on your host OS, talking to the host kernel. It's up to you. I'm going to focus on this video on just Docker Desktop alone without even bothering with the host Docker engine. I'm going to leave that to the next video, which is more about servers. Now, if you are a Linux desktop user, which probably means you're pretty good at Linux, like it's probably not your first day on Linux, you're going to need to pay attention to the details and the requirements of the setup here. It's way more steps and it's way more detailed than doing it on Mac or Windows. It's just the simple nature of Linux desktops. It's usually more involved. You probably have to install some extra requirements. You may have to check your host OS, and not every Linux distribution will work. Docker is making it work more and more on various Linux desktop distributions, but yours may not work. In this video, I'm focused entirely on Ubuntu, specifically 22.04, the latest long-term release of Ubuntu. When you go to the link for this, which is in the resources of this video, you can find the link to this documentation that will probably change over time. So maybe yours might work in the future. At the time of recording this video, for example, Mint, one of my favorite desktop installations of Linux with its Cinnamon GUI, does not work with Docker Desktop. Docker Desktop focuses on GNOME desktop features, and it does have some GNOME requirements. Basically, go read this document because it's going to keep changing as they get better and better support across the spectrum of Linux desktops. And you can see here that I had to install some dependencies first. Really, getting just curl installed is one of the most important things because I'll need that during the future install of Docker. And then down here, I have more of the steps I had to run. Again, I'm just copying, pasting from the tutorial on Docker's documentation. And because this is Ubuntu, I'm using apt and specifically apt-get to install a lot of this software. And you can see once I get to the actual Docker Desktop install, look at all that stuff. There's lots of packages there required by Docker Desktop. And that's why it's a little bit harder to make it work in every different desktop distribution of Linux because there's so many libraries here, so many dependencies. And this really is just showing you how much more desktop can do than just Docker Engine alone. And hopefully once that's successful, you will see this if you search for Docker in your start menu or whatever Ubuntu's menu is called. You can just search for it. It'll be an app that you can run. And as I've said in the other videos for Mac and Windows, that Docker Desktop, while not technically open source software, though it does come with some other open source software like Docker Engine and Docker CLI, which are themselves open source, Docker Desktop itself is not. It is actually licensed software. It has some proprietary bits in it, but the good news here is that it's always free for learning, which I have verified with management at Docker that they intend for it to be free regardless of who you work for or what company you're on. If you're allowed by your company or whoever owns your computer to install it, it is free for this course. It is free while you're learning the tooling. And once it's started the first time, you'll get the licensing agreement page. Then you'll see the Get Started with Docker page, which you can step through this if you'd like, the same as Windows and Mac, or you can just skip this part and jump into my course, which is the reason you're here, right? Now, that Docker Desktop GUI there will tell you whether or not Docker is running successfully, but you could also just go to the command terminal and type in Docker version like we did the first few videos of this course, and you'll get back the client server version if everything is good. And a little pro tip here for you, make sure you log into Docker Desktop because then that will pass on your authentication to Docker Hub. That's where you're going to get all the downloads for this course, all the images that we're going to run inside Docker. All those images for containers will need to come from Docker Hub or some other registry. Most of the time it's Docker Hub, especially when you're first beginning. And that has pull limits. We talked about this earlier in other videos, but just make sure you log into Docker Desktop with your free Docker Hub account and you don't have to worry so much about any limits you might hit. Of course, it's no big deal if you hit them. You just wait a few minutes and try again. But who wants to deal with that, right? Let's just get to it. Log in first. It doubles the limits that you have on Docker's free Docker Hub. And if you try to log in and you get this credential store not initialized error like I did, you're going to go through a couple more steps. Again, welcome to Linux, that get the proper credential storage solution on your machine to securely store your Docker login. And the documentation will probably change over the next few months or years. So I'm going to show you what it was for me. I simply needed to set up a GPG key, but you may need a few more steps, or it might be easier for you on yours once Docker solves some of these problems with automation. And again, the link for these are in the references for this lecture, but you will jump over here to documentation and basically run a GPG command to create a key, and then you'll use the pass tool to use that key and protect your login. And you'll know that you're done and it's working when you actually click the login button somewhere in the Docker interface. There's 3 or 4 places to click it. And if you click that and then you get this nice login screen, that means it's working and you can continue with your Docker ID. Now that you've logged into Docker and it's working, let's look at the settings to do a couple of tweaks that you might need for this course. The easiest way to get to the settings is under that Docker Moby icon up there at the top. Remember, his name is Moby. He's the mascot. Settings are over here. Click it. Because Docker Desktop runs in a VM, you have resources to configure. Now, Docker has conservative defaults, which means you probably want to bump them up. Personally, I don't mind bumping those up to a lot because I don't run Docker all day, every day. When I'm using it, I'm running it and it's using some resources. But when I'm not using it, I just quit or pause it and it's not using really any of these resources. I usually give it more CPUs and more RAM, somewhere between 6 or 8 gig if I can. If you don't have that much, don't worry about it. Just give it enough to make things happy when you run Docker, and you'll know if things aren't happy because they'll be either really slow or you'll get back errors when it runs out of memory. Now, this little setting is an interesting one because it's similar to what we deal with on Mac and even Windows, where we're going to be sharing files later from our host operating system into the containers. Now, in this case, it's in a virtual machine, which means you're sharing files from your host, the source code, into a container inside a VM. So there's some special magic Docker has to do to share across the file systems of these two different operating systems, the host into the container inside a VM. So you want to make sure that the directories where you store your source code are over there. And the default includes your home directory. So I just recommend always clone your code into your home directory on your local machine. It has the right permissions. It's automatically set up to share by default. And I just generally recommend that for all of my code. And I typically just put it inside home/Brett/code. I just put everything inside that code directory that I download from GitHub or any other source code. Now, if you've heard about VS Code, I think I mentioned it in every video in this section. It is my favorite code editor, but you don't have to be a developer to use it. In fact, I think it's now the best way to edit infrastructure as code files, DevOps files, sysadmin files, scripts, anything you might do on the non-dev side of tech. I still think Visual Studio Code is the best way to do it. And it runs on every OS. It runs on Linux. So download that. And then in a few videos, you'll be seeing my recommendations on your setup for VS Code, but really it's just about extensions, my favorite extensions, which VS Code will actually just recommend to you when you open the files. It'll say, hey, you open a Terraform file. Would you like to install the Terraform extension? Or hey, you have Docker installed. Would you like to install the Docker extension? It does all that for you. So really, you don't have to watch my VS Code video, but I do try to give you a few extra tips there. And finally, you just want to clone the repo from the course. The lecture earlier with all the links in it in this section for downloading all the different Docker things you need includes the repo that you want to get. And you're just going to click that link there, the little green button, and that'll give you the URL that you would use in a git clone command to download this entire course repo, which you'll be using throughout the course. And that's it. If you're a Linux desktop user, you should be fully set for the remainder of this course with all the tools you need, and have fun.